Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Special Projects Manager. I'd like to welcome you to Moment Happy Hour for today's Zoominar, The Unfortunate Convergence of Anti-Semitism and COVID-19. Please note that today's conversation is being recorded and we'll post it later this week. Today, we're having an amazing audience of people who care deeply about this issue, and we know many of you are experts on the topic. Though we can't be together for this program, we want to open up the discussion at the end. So please type your questions throughout the session in the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. After today's Zoominar, please be sure to sign up for Moment's Anti-Semitism Monitor, which reports anti-Semitic incidents around the world by country and date on a weekly basis, and is curated by Ira Forman. At a time of rising anti-Semitism and the proliferation of disinformation, the Anti-Semitism Monitor is a critical resource for countering it. You can access the Anti-Semitism Monitor and sign up for the newsletter at Moment's website. And finally, please join us next Tuesday, April 28th, for our next Zoominar with former New Yorker cartoon editor Bob Menkoff when he presents Funny You Should Ask, How and Why Jews Became the People of the Joke. Be sure to visit momentmag.com for more program updates, register for our upcoming Zoominars, and to access Moment's Guide to the Global Pandemic. Now, on to today's conversation, the unfortunate convergence of anti-Semitism and COVID-19. I'd first like to introduce Ira N. Forman. Ira is a senior fellow at the Moment Institute, where he curates Moment's Anti-Semitism Monitor. He is also a visiting professor and a senior fellow at Georgetown University Center for Jewish Civilization, and serves as a senior advisor on anti-Semitism at Human Rights First. Ira is the former U.S. State Department Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. Joining Ira today is Nadine Epstein, editor-in-chief of Moment. Nadine is the author of a recent series on George Soros. Please welcome Nadine and Ira.
Hi.
Afternoon.
Hi, Ira. Hi, everyone. Well, we could just be talking about the resurgence of anti-Semitism because that would be enough. But here we are. Yes, the world has changed dramatically in the last few weeks. And we're discussing the convergence of two different viruses. A virus that has been around for millennia, anti-Semitism, and a virus that's new. And I guess I was going to start by asking Ira, what happened? What changed? So when COVID-19 came onto the scene, it seems like years ago, but really it was only just a few months ago. What happened? How did the world of anti-Semitism change?
Well, I think, like often with anti-Semitism, when events kind of encourage the growth, you don't see it right away. So we do, of course, as you know, adding to Anti-Semitism Monitor every week. And I think through much of February, it really wasn't an issue. And I think part of that is because much of it, as we'll see today, is on the dark web, and not everybody's reading in the dark web. But ADL and the FBI and various others began putting out material, and we started picking it up, I think, in late February, early January. Not only dark web stuff, but we'll see it's grown considerably. And I think that's something that when anti-Semitism tends to peak up, you don't, around catastrophes, bad news, you might not see it right away. But as the catastrophe or the situation continues, it continues to be drawn out, unfortunately, and especially in this case.
I saw it actually come very quickly. As soon as the New Rochelle cases opened up, there was already stuff about the Jews in New Rochelle that happened. That came almost immediately as soon as it really hit New York.
And there was also comments at GW when people at the APAC conference came down with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
that's
true.
Early March.
For those of you who don't know and haven't been to our Anti-Semitism Monitor page, it's a really well done. We started it a couple years ago. I guess already 2017, 2018. And Ira curates it. He fact checks, and Moment staff helps as well, fact checking any incident, and it's broken down by country. It's very easy to understand. And there's regular updates that you can sign up for, and also Ira writes a monthly findings column. And it was interesting because a month ago or a month and a half ago, I called him and said, well, we should be doing something on the convergence of COVID-19. And he looked around and he saw there was quite a lot more than he thought was out there.
Yeah, I might add that the impetus to doing this was I teach a course at Georgetown to students on confronting contemporary anti-Semitism. The idea is we're teaching the next generation on how to combat this type of evil. And having a database by date and by country of all English language press incidents of anti-Semitism is useful for my students. And I think it's also useful for all of us, because it's not just professionals or government officials that have to tackle this. It's really citizen activists that are part of this whole battle.
And we have to be really careful because there's a lot of rumor and a lot of things that are out there that are not facts. So which brings us to conspiracy theories. Every day I hear new conspiracy theories. China is a big one. A lot of them about Jews. What kinds of conspiracy theories have you been hearing about Jews and COVID-19?
Well, first, I think that anytime you're talking about anti-Semitism, a big piece of it is conspiracy theories. Deborah Lipstadt, the famed Holocaust scholar and anti-Semitism expert, mentions this and says that essentially anti-Semitism is all conspiracy. I'm not sure I totally agree with that, but it's certainly one of the dominant, if not the dominant themes. So let's start with slide 1. So when we talk about conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism, even before COVID-19, we talk about George Soros. And this is a 2017 cartoon showing Soros as the puppet master, manipulating General McMaster, who at the time was the National Security Advisor, and General Petraeus. But of course, above Soros, if you had any doubt about the anti-Semitic nature of this, is this green hand of the Rothschilds manipulating Soros. So the puppet master is being manipulated by a higher puppet master. And now during COVID-19, we have Soros all the time being brought up. Former Milwaukee sheriff and conservative activist David Clark has said Soros has got to be behind this. Of course, in Hungary, where Soros has been a regular punching bag, and Nadine, you've written about this, in recent weeks in Parliament, people are linking, of course, refugees and the coronavirus, and of course, who's responsible for the refugees? Soros. So this is, Soros is a major player in this, but it's not just about conspiracy theories. Can we see slide 3, Suzanne? It's, many of you may have seen this gentleman in the hazmat suit. He's called, the meme is called the Happy Merchant. It's used by anti-Semites for years now, particularly on the right, to show kind of the greedy, conniving Jew. And he shows up, he's probably the most prominent meme. And of course, this one is came off of the dark web, showing Jews now, the conniving merchant trying to make money, because there's the kind of the hands wringing of making money is always part of this. We go next slide, slide 4. Another and related is the this is the view under the microscope of the COVID virus. Large hook-nosed, crooked teeth, yellow teeth, multi-headed Jew. And this is a big piece of COVID-19, but also often forms of not just anti-Semitism, but other forms of bigotry and hatred. When you turn people into rats insects, germs, COVID-19, as we'll see, and even humanoid, like you see in the Happy Merchant. You dehumanize them and makes it that much easier to start perpetrating violence and eventually killing people. So the other piece that brings together kind of COVID-19 and anti-Semitism is history. So we can go back to the 14th century with the Black Plague. And as the Black Plague spread first through the Southern Mediterranean and Asia Minor, and then up through Europe, who was blamed constantly were Jews. Actually, there was a letter written to the Pope explaining this from some of the German cities. And even the Pope at that time, of course, was not friendly to Jews. Even the Pope said, this is ridiculous. How are they poisoning wells to essentially perpetrate the Black Plague when they have to drink from the same wells as you do? But of course, rational arguments and anti-Semitism usually don't mix at all. And again, Jews were killed for, again, perpetrating the plague.
Can I just say something, Ira? There's actually a really good story on the web that Moment published called "Why Were Jews Blamed for the Black Death" by Dan Friedman. And it goes into this in detail. And he interviews David Nirenberg, and he interviews professor at Yale. But anyways, it's very interesting. It's worth taking a look at.
Time interviewing David Nirenberg, you're really talking to someone who's looked and thought a great deal about the whys of anti-Semitism and how Western civilization is almost dependent on the idea of Jews and Judaism, even when in societies there are no Jews. So I'm a big fan of Nirenberg, and I recommend his anti-Judaism book. He really wants to delve deeply into the background of anti-Semitism historically as well as today.
It also interviews Paul Friedman, who's a professor of medieval history at Yale, which is good too.
So, other questions, Nadine?
Oh, okay. Well, I guess I saw that David Duke has been involved in some of this as well.
David Duke always shows up, and the interesting thing about David Duke, besides white nationalist, white supremacist, anti-Semite, is that Duke is so ubiquitous on the web that oftentimes you'll hear people who are not at all sympathetic to what you would think would be the radical right. So in recent years, in the Labor Party under Jeremy Corbyn, you would see some labor activists actually use David Duke memes from the web and circulate them. And he has also, of course, made comments about Jews being behind this, but he has to join a long line of others, lining up a long line of others to make these lies about Jews.
Well, this is a really important point that we talked about earlier, is that a large part of this is coming from the xenophobic right, but that's not the only source of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories right now. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the other aspects as well?
Let's certainly, when you look at the internet, the white supremacist right, the white nationalist right, the xenophobic right, it seems to be in the lead. Let's go to slide 14, Suzanne. But beyond, there you went past it. There, nope, 14. No. There you go.
Yes.
This is a picture which is much scarier than the material on the web. As we all know, in recent weeks, there have been a number of demonstrations in state capitals against the lockdowns and social isolation. And this was in Columbus, Ohio. And one of the protesters was driving around a car with, going back to the idea of Jews as rats with pointy noses, the real plague. This person was involved with not only was riding around these two people in the car, but they got out as part of the protest. But of course, there's others. So we have a lot of Islamist extremism. So for example, let's go to, let's see, number 6, Suzanne, if you would. This 6? I don't think so. One before it, Suzanne. No, that's after. There you go. So the Iranian Health Ministry held a contest, a cartoon contest about COVID-15. And of course, some of the winners were anti-Semitic. This is one of them. You have Uncle Sam releasing COVID-19, dancing on what appears to be a Hasid's or Haredi hat with the Star of David. And of course, the good guys with the vaccine are coming through the tent to stop it. We have the next slide, which is 7. This is also one of the winners. Uncle Sam riding the globe with his foot in the stirrup, Star of David, and spurs, which is the COVID virus. And then the next one is number 8. Jewish doctors, one of which the lead appears to have something coming out of his head. They're not exactly horns, but again, this is humanoid. Someone who is baking up this coronavirus. One of the things we see all the time is, and where the difference is with Jews often and other victims of slurs of COVID virus or other things, is the Jew is not just a subhuman, but also is a crafty and sly subhuman who is actually behind these other kind of subhumans like African Americans or Latinos or other immigrants, etc., manipulating them to destroy white society. So you have this, and you have it of course, in other Muslim countries as well. We have, let's see, let's go to slide 9. Okay, so in Palestine, there is a hashtag now being used of hashtag COVID-48, I assume meaning referencing Israel's birth. And as you can see, this is one of them. This is virus COVID-19 and the Jewish virus. Next slide, if you could. Again, Palestinian workers with decontamination, with going after the various germs, COVID-48, COVID-19 together. Again, the dehumanization. And the next slide. And finally, again, here's the hashtag COVID-48, all the COVID-19 viruses and the Jewish viruses surrounding what we assume was a Palestinian. So you have that, but also not only that, but you have some of the stuff coming from the left. So you have people, some Basques recently, separatists who are on the left, talked about Yankee Zionist imperialism behind the spread of COVID-19. We have it in Venezuela, which is been long a very anti-Semitic, although thankfully not violent regime against its dwindling Jewish community. But again, Venezuelans from the left talking about this type of Jewish conspiracy, usually colonialist, U.S. and the United States and Israel together as the colonialist imperialists. You also have, let's go to slide 15 if you would, Suzanne. You have, go back one. Pastor Rick Wiles, who of fame during the impeachment trial, talked about the Jew coup, is now talking about God punishing the Jews by sending the viruses through synagogues and infecting Jews at higher numbers and sending it out to the world as punishment for the rejection of Christ. Let's go to slide 16 as well. So this isn't exactly COVID-19, but it just came out in Italy this last month. A well-known young Catholic painter who paints many things for the church came out with a slide about the blood libel. Just at the time, Italy was getting hit extremely hard with COVID-19. So this is formerly Saint Simon. Church has revoked the sainthood. A child that was murdered in, I believe, about the 17th century. And here you have Jews stabbing the young Saint Simon. This is someone who's been recognized by the church. Now, the church, despite its long, brutal history toward Judaism, has come a long way. It's really been revolutionary. And as we worked at the State Department, and I work now with the church, we look at it as one of our great allies in the fight against anti-Semitism. It's not just the Pope, but it depends on the bishops' conferences. The U.S. bishops' conferences does tremendous work against anti-Semitism. But you have parts of the church that still go back to these memes, hook-nosed, crooked teeth, yellow teeth, sinister-looking Jews stabbing a little Christian child. So this stuff is coming from all different sectors. And though this isn't directly tied to COVID-19, it came out in the context of the virus and other people tweeting, etc., about Jewish conspiracy.
So Ira, how, there are a certain number of people out in the world, and more than we would imagine, who are very susceptible to conspiracy theories, and all sorts of people are sending me things that even I'm surprised they're sending them to me, but they think there could be some truth to them. And I'm wondering, like, is it really just a small group of people, or are these conspiracy theories about Jews and about others, are they somehow impacting the larger zeitgeist in the world right now, which is we're in a very fragile place. We're very vulnerable.
Yeah.
What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of ways to measure this, and oftentimes it's most useful to look at country by country. So, for example, in the United States, there's no doubt that anti-Semitic incidents are up. We always look at not just what numbers of anti-Semitic incidents, but also looking at what types. So violence, we've had violence against Jews, the 11 killed in Tree of Life, the person killed in the Poway Chabad, Jersey City, we had 3 people killed. We had a person killed in Muncie recently. And other forms of violence. Haredis in New York and New Jersey are getting attacked and also often blamed for COVID violence. So you have those manifestations. At the same time, you have clearly people primarily on the alt-right, but not just on the alt-right. We have people like Farrakhan, et cetera, who are engaging in this type of material. Always has, but certainly hasn't stopped or let up. We have people on the extreme left engaging in this material. And so on the other hand, if you look at public opinion, there's no indication that public opinion has changed. The numbers of hardcore anti-Semites, whether you look at something like the ADL survey that's been done since the mid to late 60s, it shows, again, anti-Semitism at historically low levels. If you look at the Pew survey, which I think is very interesting, Pew does a thermometer on all religions in America. And Pew, for the last 4 or 5 years, has found that the highest feeling of warmth to any one religion is Judaism. In recent years, it was a thermometer of 66 degrees, is from 0 to 100. And the next highest was Catholicism at 63. So US public opinion hasn't changed. This doesn't, and the other piece of this, of course, is the strength of the American Jewish community in many ways, the strongest diasporic community, I think, undoubtedly in history. Doesn't mean that we should be ignoring the rise of anti-Semitism. When you dehumanize, when you make Jews into humanoids, into vermin, into rats, etc., these are bad things that could catch on. Add to it the situation, of course, with the pandemic we're in and having no idea when we're going to come out of it, an economic crash that we haven't seen since the 1930s. Lord knows what comes out of this. And as I mentioned before, we tend to see this stuff grow over time. So you don't see it often as much at the beginning of a pandemic, beginning of an economic downslide. What happened in 2008 and 2009 we didn't see all the manifestations right away. We saw it took till 2010, for example, in Hungary in the election campaign that year for rabid anti-Semites to be elected to the parliament, and anti-Semitic sentiment rising dramatically in Hungary in 2010. We saw it took till 2015 when the refugee crisis. I just remember sitting in the foreign ministry with Israeli experts talking about the refugee crisis, and I just assumed the Israelis would start talking about these are people from Syria and other Muslim countries, and they were going to come to a place like Germany, and the anti-Semitism would grow. And they had some worry about that, but they really were worried about the backlash of the populist right, which I think they're very prescient about. And in places like Germany, you have tremendous anti-Semitism in parts of Muslim communities, and that hasn't gone away, but you also have a rise of the right. So I think that, again, as much as I'm concerned about the United States, I'm much more concerned about some of the countries in Europe and in the Muslim world. Communities like France, Germany, the Low Countries, Belgium and Netherlands, and in Eastern Europe, Poland, which has a very small Jewish community, but until very recently a thriving community. Hungary is a major problem because the willingness in much of Eastern Europe, but particularly in Hungary, to lie about history, lie about what happened during the Holocaust, and say, oh, this was all Nazis and Germans. We had really very little to do about it. Oh, there were a few bad eggs. This type of distorting of history is extremely dangerous. And then you look at the larger Jewish communities that are left in the Muslim world. Actually, interestingly, they're not in Arab countries. We have very tiny communities left, if at all. The only ones really that really could be called communities are Morocco and Tunisia. And I worry a little less about them than I worry about the larger communities in Turkey and Iran. This stuff, if God knows how long the economic crisis, let alone the pandemic crisis, will be with us. These are bad circumstances. This is good feeding grounds for a growth of anti-Semitism. And it's going to take not just government action, it's going to take civil society action to push back against this.
Are there some communities in the United States that you're particularly worried about?
I'm looking more about ultra-Orthodox Jews, Haredi. They're not people who are going to easily assimilated. They're readily identified. And when you talk about anti-Semitism, a lot of times people want to say, well, it's either coming from extremist Muslims, it's coming from, it's only coming from the left, or it's only coming from the right. This is all garbage. It's coming from multiple sources. And if you want to play games and say, well, it's more important here, it's more important there, well, in some countries it's obvious. I mean, in Hungary, there's only really right-wing anti-Semitism. There's nothing from the left. There are no Muslims. But, you can even take those categories and say, where is the attacks against Jews in Brooklyn? This is not Muslims. This is not extreme right, and this is not extreme left. These are young, often minority kids, but not always, who are attacking Haredis in Brooklyn, but you see it in Lakewood in New Jersey, you see it in Muncie. Yes. They're the most vulnerable. And I think for some obvious reasons, the rest of us, when we walk around, we don't usually have kippahs on, or oftentimes we don't have a Star of David.
Well, let's talk about Lakewood for a second, because it's close to home, close to where I grew up. And there actually was, in Ocean County, New Jersey, there has been a sort of group that's been very vocal and on Facebook about kind of being upset about vocally talking about how the Jews have taken over Lakewood. And now that was already there. And from what I can see now, that's kind of morphed into this whole conversation about COVID-19. And it's not,
Lakewood.
It's not a big bastion of right wing. It's certainly not a bastion of left wing. It's just kind of regular people.
You see this in Rockland County. You see it, and frankly, when you mentioned right at the beginning, New Rochelle. Well, this was one of the first outbreaks, and where was it? It was a Jewish lawyer who was the first one identified. New Rochelle has a significant secular Jewish community, and not particularly religious. And we had a quarantine around. Of course, that ended quickly, but you had, as we said, some of the first kind of pointing fingers at Jews came from that. But yes, you have a serious problem. You have tension between locals and Haredi's coming in who are buying up property, et cetera. And it's frankly just getting, looking for a better way of life, a cheaper way of life outside the city, which a lot of people do. But of course, the tightness of the community and discussions over school funding, et cetera, are controversial. But that does not have to lead to, this type of anti-Semitic material. You have it coming out. You had it was a public official who said something, who had got fired. And luckily, what you see, the governor of New Jersey, other elected officials have been speaking out. We need elected officials to speak out, and we need it starting at the White House, and we need it going all the way down to the city council level, school board, et cetera. But we also need civil society to stand up on this stuff. And I think, especially in this country, it's the strongest weapon we have. If we have civil society, if we have Catholic churches and Protestant churches and evangelical churches, mainline Protestant and evangelical, we have Muslim allies, like in places like Pittsburgh, which is a great example of how a community came together behind the Jewish community after Tree of Life. That's going to be one of our best weapons in the long term against this problem. And of course, this also means we have to deal with security in Jewish communities. I sit on my synagogue board. We're spending a lot more money these days on armed guards than we never did. And I know this is happening at every Jewish institution. We have a huge education problem. Our Holocaust survivors are dying off, and Yoma showed it tonight. And they're dying off, and we're not going to have any witnesses, et cetera. Lots of people don't know about the Holocaust. We need education. And we have to also admit, we don't know what type of education actually works. Europe, you're taught in many school systems in Europe, the history of the Holocaust. Well, for many of these kids, often Muslim kids, Muslim immigrants, this is dry history. You might as well be talking about the Roman Empire. But there are ways, part of it is survivors have done a really good job of some of this, but there are other ways to make these types of messages part and meaningful to these children's lives. That type of education, but we have to understand what type, because our resources in fighting this are limited. They're always limited. And we need to be spending it on really education that works. And then, of course, the internet. How we are pushing the major internet players, the social media players, to take down material. I think that's the right thing to do. But then the other question is it better to have them on Twitter and Facebook than to have them on 4chan and Telegraph, et cetera, where many of us can't see them? And that's an ongoing debate. And we're ultimately not this is, there's also free speech issues, frankly, not by the major social media folks. They have terms of service, and they're not government entities. Freedom of speech is having the government stop free speech. It doesn't have it doesn't have these commercial players don't have to allow any type of speech. So there's a multi-pronged approach that we have to take to start confronting this stuff.
Well, I just want to add, I think we need to especially also reach out into the African American community, which has had at times a very strong relationship with the Jewish community, and that's very important as well to be doing.
Minority communities as well. I mean, there's been a lot of work that Jewish organizations have done over the last few decades with not just the African American community, but also Latino community. Some of those things are paying off in both communities for us. Mm-hmm. It's also a matter, if we're expecting civil society to stand up to anti-Semitism, it's
we have to strengthen civil society
to partake. And when it's not just anti-Semitism, if it's racism, if it's anti-Latino sentiment, if it's homophobic, if it's Islamophobic, it's our job to confront it in civil society, as well as expecting our allies to be supporting us on anti-Semitism.
Well, there's also been a tremendous amount of anti-Asian COVID-19 conspiracy theories as well. Some of it that's been focused on Asian Americans, and even the governor of Washington State Are there parts of it that are just simply China? And again, I mean, some of, there's a tremendous amount of information, misinformation out about China.
Let's, Suzanne, would you put up slide number 12?
Sure. I also want to get to some of the questions.
Yes, there's some very good questions, and I want to talk about them in a second. So
okay.
Right after this.
Before the anti-Semitism stuff that I at least were picking up, we were picking up anti-China stuff. And of course, that's reviving now. So we have a lot of memes like this, Winnie the Flu. Let's go to the next one. This is Walter Sobchak in The Big Lebowski. It's actually John Goodman, but this is on the dark web. When I see a Chinese boy coughing, me kill the virus. So you have threats of violence against Asian Americans. Interestingly, though, usually one of the differences of anti-Semitism against other forms of prejudice is Jews are kind of, even though they're humanoid and kind of vermin, they're also crafty, skilled, and smart, too smart, and they are manipulating people like George Soros. The Chinese are the same in that sense. The Chinese are, China is not just these subhumans, but they are crafty, and they are anti-American, and they're smart, maybe smarter than we are. And so that's the meme. But, you mentioned there's homophobia going on associated with COVID-19. There is slurs against blacks, and in fact, there are many parts of the white nationalist right who are hoping this will create violence eventually and allow for the revolution. So there are all kinds of folks who are looking to take out their agenda of hate with this pandemic and the economic pain that we're all feeling.
So COVID-19 is a very good, it's a tool that people can use, and it seems to be a powerful tool. I just want to say that a reader sent me something about China, which was that China created the pandemic deliberately. It was a newscast from India, and it was, I get a lot of these things, and that it was a plan, something they've been planning for decades to do this. But anyways, I wanted to get to some of the questions that we have. And one day I just wanted that Sarah Brieger, our deputy editor, is on, and she just saw that anti-Semitic flyers are being passed around DC, blaming Jews for COVID-19 and calling for the Jewish expulsion of Jews. And that there was actually there's actually a photo of a man who's been handing out some of this propaganda in the Dumbarton, Georgetown area, there are a lot of Jews there because it's within walking distance of Kesher, Israel. So this is something I hadn't heard about before, but it's really interesting.
Flyer?
Actually, right after, in 2016, right after the election, there were also all sorts of anti-Semitic flyers right outside in front of our house on the sidewalk. But that was before COVID-19, and let's focus on that. Bruce Waxman was asking, he said that, some of the places that you've been talking about, Ira, the Tree of Life, predate COVID-19. How about talking about where there has already, I think what he's trying to say here is, what about places where maybe there's new COVID-19 anti-Semitism, or I guess maybe the other, don't understand the question. So maybe Bruce, you want to rewrite it for us? That would be great.
I think also I have another question here under the Q&A, and I think Bruce wanted to hear a little bit more about the anti-Semitism that has popped up since COVID-19, more of the recent. And then David would like to know, how should our leaders respond to this, and how can they address this and other scapegoating without amplifying it?
I'll talk to the last one. The amplification is always important. So you always are making judgments. If someone, for example, the classic was this pastor in Florida was burning Qurans. And he was something of a kind of a loony right-wing nut, and had done this in the past. But once he got some publicity, there was tremendous kind of news coverage of this. And so you really don't want to amplify someone who is, the classic stereotype of someone who is in his pajamas with used to be a mimeograph machine, now it's a computer and email, or the social media. You don't want to amplify these people. So again, you have to make the judgment, and this is both at the level of political leadership, and perhaps as equally important is local level civil society. When do you want to amplify it? And of course, when you have a lot of people seeing the material already, when you have someone of some substance saying this, or some credibility saying, or a lot of followers, that's when you want to use our free speech mechanisms. People have free speech to say all kinds of odious things in the United States, but our best weapon is to push back. One of the things that's happened, even though public opinion is not kind of turned against Jews in the last few years in this country, we've talked about the incidents, but it's also taboos have been broken. It's easier to put this material out. It's not as social ostracizing. And that social ostracism is a really important thing. Just one example of that is in Charlottesville. Charlottesville was a horrible thing, and we should wish it never happened. But there are all kinds of consequences. A lot of those young men who were filmed on television came back to local communities and were kicked out of their house by their parents. A lot of them were lost jobs. A lot of these organizations essentially went bankrupt, many of which are being sued by civil suits, etc. So, part of what we have to do is push it back, push them back under the rocks, make it socially difficult for them to say these things. They can still say it, but they're not. It's like 25 years ago in Billings, Montana, when the white nationalists were intimidating the few Jews in Billings by throwing things through windows, bricks through windows where menorahs were, etc. The community came together pretty spontaneously. The religious community, the local political leaders, both local civic leaders. There were marches of people carrying menorahs. There were people who put literally tens of thousands of menorahs, pictures of menorahs in their windows that the local paper had put out. And there was a strong message of saying, the Jewish community is part of us. Whoever did this, you're not part of us. We don't want you from us, and we'll ostracize you. Those are the powerful weapons, I think, is not the only ones. But again, you have to be careful not to take someone who's a nut job, who has no visibility, and promote it. Unfortunately, right now, there's a lot more of it out there. And when you have, say, hundreds of flyers in Georgetown, people are going to notice.
Well, someone here, go ahead.
I've said my piece on this.
I was just going to say that one of our panelists, Leora Rez, has told us that the man from Columbus, Ohio, the one that was holding up the Rat Jew sign that we showed the photo of, has been also identified as a veteran criminal, Matt Slatzer, who has extensive criminal background, including battery, assault, weapons possession, and drug-related charges. So, again, that just being able to identify somebody is usually important, and know who he is.
Dina would like to know that why in Jewish communities in the Far East, like Thailand, and maybe even in China, that there doesn't seem to be a history of blaming Jews for COVID.
Well, I think one of the reasons is these communities have been historically tiny. They've been minuscule. So, yes, Jews are small numbers in Europe for 2 millennium, relatively. But remember, for most of the last 1,000 years, Jews were essentially the only religious minority in Europe, and so they were the prominent other. And in Muslim lands, you had Christians and Jews, but the Jews were the only minority that really had not had sovereignty since the destruction of the temple. and didn't were always kind of second-class citizens wherever they lived. But they were in places like Thailand. I mean, these communities were always negligible. And then we had some kind of community in India, but compared to the vastness of India, even those Jewish communities were just tiny, tiny. So once you got past the Middle East, and you just did not have any visibility. Now, of course, we have, one of the things about anti-Semitism, again, is different than many types of hatred, is you can have anti-Semitism without Jews. And so it's not impossible to have that. And we have, for example, I'm not an expert on this, but South Korea, you could call it a philo-Semitic country. A lot of respect for their business acumen, their success, et cetera, in sciences and various other things. And in fact, as I understand it, many people in China, in South Korea, read kind of abridged little versions of the Talmud as a way of understanding how to be a good businessman, how to attain power. Now, is that philo-Semitism really something that we want? And there's sometimes a small space between that philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism. But well, you certainly have in places like Malaysia, you have widespread anti-Semitism. You had until recently a prime minister who was very openly anti-Semitic. You have even in very moderate Muslim countries like Indonesia, you've had some rise of anti-Semitism. But again, these communities are so negligible that it has not historically been a big problem. But again, we look at anti-Semitism in Europe, for example, Shakespeare or Chaucer, who wrote anti-Semitic material, never knew Jews. There were no Jews in England during their lifetimes. St. Augustine probably never met a Jew. Maybe he met a Jew in court once. But essentially, he could write this whole philosophy and think a lot about Jews and Judaism, not about real Jews or real Judaism, but Judaism is a concept that explains often bad things in a society. So I don't think any Jewish community, as small as it might be, is always, can be confident that this type of virus doesn't spread. But for whatever reasons, it has largely not in South Asia. But again, there's never been any significant Jewish communities in these places.
We're going to take a few more questions, so if anybody has one, please feel free to either type it in the chat, which several people are doing, as well as the question and answer section at the bottom of your screen. Also, Cecily wanted to know, do you use the Southern Poverty Law Center and UN Watch as resources for information?
Once in a while, but in terms of our anti-Semitism monitor, we are using news sources. So usually not, unless it's a press release that is up in a paper or something, we're usually not using organizational material out there. But once in a while, Southern Poverty Law Center and other groups, other civil society groups, we pick up on, usually when they get their material in the news. Because we're using aggregators on the internet to pick up these stories on anti-Semitism, and we're using a couple other news sources to try to, English language news sources to pick up this material.
So Ira, I have a question. What can we as individuals be doing? I know we are as an organization publishing this. I know we're speaking about it, but what can we all as individuals do? Who should we be writing? Should we be speaking to someone? How should we reach out? I know that during Passover, I always try to invite non-Jews to my Seder because I feel like it's a really important way to just reach out. But Passover's over, and what do we do now?
Well, I don't have a blueprint. What I do have, what we all have, is historical knowledge. So what I would ask, what is probably the greatest human rights victory, at least for Jewish communities, certainly in the last 100 years? It's the Soviet Jewry movement. The Soviet Jewry movement was not led by politicians, nor was it led originally at all by Jewish organizations that are established organizations. It was led by citizen activists, literally a handful of scientists who founded the Cleveland Committee, the Conference on Anti-Semitism, and student activists in New York, who figured that even the mighty Soviet Union would somehow listen. And when they started, it was considered ridiculous to think the Soviet Union, which had never really let, in the post-war period, let people emigrate, certainly not Jews who had all this education, and et cetera, and given the high levels of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, that they would possibly let them go. But they put pressure. They started putting pressure on Jewish organizations. They started putting pressure on governments. Our government, out of that came Jackson Vanik. It grew. So I don't have the exact formula. My sense is that there are lots of different things you can do. If you're tech savvy, thinking about how do we push back on hate speech on social media, and especially social media that's constantly changing its nature. I think ADL is doing some work on that, and people who are tech savvy could think about how do we push back. I mean, I think we know a lot less about how to push back in places like Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, et cetera, than we do how to push back in other medias, traditional medias like print media, electronic media, et cetera. You can, there are, what we're going to be going toward in this country, I'm afraid, is increasing security at Jewish organizations. In Europe, Jewish communities, some get lots of help from the government, but all of them rely primarily on their volunteer Jewish security organizations to protect them. And places in like the SPCJ in France and CST, Community Security Trust, are all volunteer. They may have some staff now, but they're basically volunteer organizations out of the community that are focused and learned how to protect their own Jewish communities and work very closely with law enforcement, the judiciary system, prosecutors, et cetera. So those are places, but I also believe this whole notion of civil society. And we have examples of this where civil society pushes back. You have it, usually they're spontaneous in places like Pittsburgh. But I think the notion of exploring how at the local level, whether it be Washington, D.C. or Baltimore or Detroit, local levels, putting together coalitions of not just Jews, but Jews and other, I would start with other religious groups. And that means, again, not just Christians of mainline Protestant and evangelicals and Catholics, but also other minority groups and Muslims, etc. And then also bringing in local politicians, bringing other local civic leaders to think about ahead of time, what do we do when bigotry and hatred raises their head? And this is one of the best things we have, protection against anti-Semitism. You talk to French Jews, well, at least the ones I've talked to over the years, they'll often tell me, governments have been great in the last decade or two, whether it's a center-right government under Sarkozy or a socialist government under Hollande and Valls, or the current government, centrist government under Macron. They've been great and they've been very supportive, but they will say to you often, but if we don't have support from civil society, where were all the thousands of people in the street when people were holding signs, Je suis Charlie Hebdo, Je suis Juif? There weren't those signs. And unless civil society rises up, they're very pessimistic about their future, and not just about Jews, but actually of democracy. So those are some thoughts. I teach this to try to get practitioners involved in either government or NGOs, but I also tell my students, you don't have to do it just this way. Citizens activists can have a major role, but it takes a lot of work and you have to get yourself educated first. Those are what those student groups, the groups of scientists in literally out of Nathan in Ohio did that. And they used classic organizing techniques and classic Saul Alinsky stuff for getting attention from organizations and from governments. So those are some of my thoughts. And if you can become the special envoy for anti-Semitism, it's the best job of the US government.
I think we have time for one more question, and then if Nadine, you want to wrap it up from there. Roz wants to know, is there always a correlation between an economic or other crisis and rise of anti-Semitism?
No, not always. It's not always that simple. It often is, because, as David Nuremberg would say, thinking about Jews and thinking about Judaism is a huge piece of Western civilization. And it doesn't always require that you have crises. But we do have a fair amount of, and one of the things I would say about anti-Semitism, it is definitely something that can't be often rationally described or rationally argued away. And it's another thing, I think we have to be realistic in what we're trying to do. Because of that, even in good times, it's like every generation has to fight this. Because we're not in the business of trying to end anti-Semitism. We're not going to end anti-Semitism. Not in our lifetimes, not in our grandchildren's lifetimes, and not in our great-great-great-grandchildren's lifetimes. This is not rocket science to say this. This has been around for 2,000 years. It's likely to be around for centuries to come. And the question is not ending it, it's turning the faucet down. We can't turn the faucet off, we can turn it down. It was turned down after World War II. We can do it again. But it requires, like every generation, internal vigilance. And sometimes it will be, and when we have crises, we have to be particularly on our toes. And it's also, I personally believe that it's also very highly correlated with the health and strengths of democracies. You look at where Jews live, Jews have fled all the non-free countries in the world. You look compared to forget even the Holocaust, even post-Holocaust. Look at Jewish populations spread around the world. Jews don't tend to leave autocracies and totalitarian countries. And I think there's a reason for that. And the health of democracies and the health of civil society is correlated with the health of Jewish communities, in my opinion.
I have one more question that one of our panelists, which I just think is a really important question that I'd like to fit in before I wrap up. It's from Larry Cantor in Florida. Is there a difference between COVID, anti-Semitism in general, and anti-Israelism?
Well, I haven't thought about it in that sense. Well, certainly, the type of anti-Semitism, many people call it the new anti-Semitism, where Israel is the new Jew, has its markers. It's so oftentimes anti-Semites who are using anti-Israel imagery, they're talking about Zionists. They may oftentimes, although they often slip, they won't talk about Jews. They'll talk about Zionists or Zios or Israelis, thinking that that protects them from any charges of anti-Semitism. So now, of course, there's a whole continuum of this, and criticism of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic. I mean, what we call the working definition of anti-Semitism that almost all Jewish organizations around the world and most democracies have been advocating for, defines a series of steps like demonizing Israel, delegitimizing Israel, treating Israel with a double standard as anti-Semitic, but it's also cautious. It says it may be, you have to look at context. And that criticism of Israel, similar to criticism of other countries, is not anti-Semitic. But usually the giveaway is, you start talking about Zionists, and there is either a delegitimization, if you don't also slip into the Jew into the conversation, if it's delegitimization, if it's double standards, if it's demonization, such as when one criticizes Israel for, say, what it does with Palestinians, reasonable criticism, even if you disagree with it, it's fine. When you start saying things like what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians is exactly what the Nazis did to the Jews, that's anti-Semitism.
Or when you're questioning whether Israel should exist or not.
So that's delegitimization. So so those are giveaways. Some of this COVID-19 anti-Semitism uses those terms. You look at the Iranian stuff. Well, the Iranians will tell you, well, we love our Jews. Of course, they're clearly second and third class citizens. We love our Jews. And in fact, there is some truth. They do protect that Jewish community. It's a propaganda point for them, nothing else. But of course, the community keeps shrinking, but it's still larger than almost any other Muslim community in the world, maybe comparable to Turkey. But you see this COVID stuff, you see oftentimes they use the code words of Zionism. And, but when there are usually some giveaways that this isn't just being people criticizing Israel. It goes much, much beyond that.
Well, we've gone over time, and I want to thank Ira, not just for doing this today, but also for all the hard work that he's put into building the Anti-Semitism Monitor and making his findings every month. And I hope you'll all sign up for the Anti-Semitism Monitor on our website. And
thank you, Nadine, for putting this on.
And I want everyone to stay safe and stay home if you can.
Yes. And thank you both for this very powerful Zoominar. And again, please go to our website to sign up for the Anti-Semitism Monitor. And you can also register for future Zoominars that we have coming up a little bit more lighthearted in the coming weeks. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.